Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Takudzwa Mutize. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of the Free State. The paper I'm about to present, I co-authored with Justin Visahi, and I would like to also thank Prof. Turok, who provided very valuable comments to the paper. So the title is up there, and this is what we're going to be covering. I'll try to rush through and reach the results so that we can have more discussion, and I can make use of the valuable people inside this room. So the core research question of the paper was, does moving between cities in South Africa lead to better economic outcomes for individuals compared to those people who stay in the same city between 2008 and 2017? And the sub-questions were, how does intercity migration impact income levels and employment, as well as wage levels, which in this study, we define them as economic mobility. And are there any economic outcomes, differences between people who move from urban areas to other metros, or those who move and settle into other urban areas which are not metros? And we're also looking if there are any premiums for being a mover with better skills compared to if you have lower skills. So intercity migration in South Africa, even though it's understudied, it's very important because cities are magnets for job seekers, offering greater quantity and quality of jobs compared to rural areas and other smaller towns. And in South Africa, as already alluded to, cities contribute, the metros contribute about 60% of GDP, half of employment, and 40% of the people were located in South Africa's 8 largest cities. And metros have larger populations, they offer more economic diversity. However, secondary cities are also important, and some research from using text data showed that if we were to add the metros and the non-metros, the contribution of employment is about 80% of the economy. So the research gap is that migration studies in South Africa, which have looked at internal migration, have mostly focused on rural to urban migration, and even economic development theories, they emphasize rural to urban migration as a means for upward mobility. However, the studies of intercity migration have been lacking, even though the country is highly urbanized and would expect people to be moving between cities more compared to just rural to urban areas. So there have been some findings that moving from rural to urban areas increases, incomes of people and puts them out of poverty. And there's also been studies on interprovincial migration. However, we think that this is the first study on intercity migration and how it can benefit people, if there's any benefit, but we'll see in the upcoming slides. So mobility of labor between cities may yield productivity gains and new economic opportunities. And these are studies done in Colombia and China, which have shown that people who have moved from smaller cities to larger metros have gained in terms of employment outcomes and income and wages. So we'll see in the South African context if this is the same. So, of course, we'll discuss the policy relevance at the end, but I think this study is important in a policy, in the policy space, because intercity migration could help balance labor markets, reducing urban inequalities. And such a study, if we are to understand the economic outcomes of migrants after relocation, it can guide policymakers in crafting migration policies that can maximize benefits for both migrants and the local economies. So I think it's important to know the outcomes of people who move. So should we support migration? Is it helping people actually? Or it's people are just migrating and putting affecting the infrastructure in the destination cities without any improvement to their outcomes or the outcomes of those local economies. So the study is based on the human capital theory and the neoclassical migration theory. The first one, it states that migration decisions are influenced by the anticipated economic returns. So we would expect that people with more skills, because people with more skills, they have a higher probability to migrate because they obviously expect better returns from that investment in their skills. And then the neoclassical migration theory, it states that migration balances labor supply and demand as workers move from low-wage areas to high-wage areas, in turn equalizing regional inequalities in wages and incomes as well. So the data source for this study is the National Income Dynamic Study, which is South Africa's nationally representative longitudinal survey, and was done between 2008 to 2017, about 10 years, and which is our study's focus. And we separated, we created a sample of people in the working age population for South Africa, and we categorized them into three groups: non-migrants, which are individuals who remained in the same area, in the same urban area. In the needs data, there's urban area and then traditional and farming areas. So people who stayed in the same urban area, those were about 3,888. And we had urban to metro migrants, which were about 660, and individuals moving between different urban areas, excluding metros. So you can see the sample size. It's about 4,900. So it makes sense that the sample is this small, because we are focusing on urban to urban movements, and also it makes sense because we want people who provided responses for all our questions on the variables such as education and age and gender, marital status across those 10 years. So for the econometric models used, we use the ordinary least squares, the fixed effects, and the difference in difference. And taken together, these three models, help us to get at least close to causality on the impact of migration on economic outcomes. And here, the key findings, we'll start with the descriptive findings. The key highlights are that there's a higher propensity to migrate among young, single, educated individuals, and their income gains and employment gains from migration. And these are the tables which support it. As you can see, if we look at age, if you compare the first cohort, which is cohort 1, for those who remained in the urban area, we can see that they are younger. The average age was 34, compared to migrants who had average ages of 23 and 28. This was in 2000 and 2008. And then we can also see that migrants tend to be single. The average age for those who were married or cohabiting in 2008 for non-migrants was 43, yet for migrants was about 30 to 31 years and about 29 years. So it's in line with what they call the young and the restless in developed countries, where younger people are more likely to move, whether in search for employment or education. And as we move to the next slide, we can see that in terms of level of skills, we can see that migrants tend to have a larger proportion of the high-skilled people, compared to non-migrants, for example, about 14.8 here, and comparing it to 21.6, and comparing it with 19.7 and 16.5. Right, so migrants tend to be more educated, so it could be that they're migrating because of search of employment or education opportunities. And between 2008 and 2017, unemployment reduced for all three cohorts. However, it seemed to have reduced more for the migrant cohorts if we are to see the unemployment rates here. So we move on to the findings on income gains and employment, and we make use of histograms and then transition matrices. As we can see, for all three cohorts, they benefited from increase in income. However, we can see that the urban to metro migrants and the urban to urban migrants have more bars to the right. They have more bars to the right, showing that from their groups, more people had income gains. And then if we move on to poverty transitions, because income gain does not necessarily lead to reduced poverty. You can have an income gain of 100 rands, but you coming out of poverty. We want to see that from this diagram where we use an upper bound poverty line of 1136 based on the literature. And we can see that the migrants had more people escaping out of poverty. For example, if we compare this 81% and 81% here, with only 62%. So it was not only income gains, but many people came out of poverty due to the migration move. And then if we look at labor market transitions, that gives us an advantage from panel data. We can see that from the group of people who were unemployed, for example, for the migrants, these last two sub-tables, we can see that about 66.3 people, 66% of people who were unemployed moved into employment by 2017, and that's close to that same figure. Comparing it with only 55 for those who stayed in the same areas and moved into employment. We can also see that people who moved have more employment stability. If we were to look at those who remained employed, about 86% and 80% compared with 70% here. And now we move on to key findings from the regression analysis. I want you to focus on the numbers highlighted in red, which are for our key variables of interest. We can see that across all three models in terms of income gains, the gains are highly significant and they are large. For example, if we were to look at the fixed effects model and the difference in difference model, the urban to metro group had increased income by about 64 to 67%, depending on the model, and the urban to urban group had an increase of about 39%, and both findings statistically significant with validating intercity migration benefits, right? But as we can argue that people moving from people who had income gains, maybe they moved into smaller households, or or they just moved into richer households. But we want to see, could it have been that, or could it have been an increase in employment or wages? And our table on employment gains, we can see that the results are still significant, showing that migrants to urban to metro and urban to urban, compared to not migrating, had significant employment benefits. And I think also to answer the question we had on the impact of skill, we can see that even in the income gains, we do not see a significant impact of skill, meaning that there are no extra benefits in terms of having skill, but we should know that both low-skilled and high-skilled experience employment and income gains. And key findings from the wage mobility, it's mixed, because we do not see any significant results, but we have a small sample size because we're looking at people who were employed in both ways. But we also ran another regression where we imputed zeros for those who were unemployed, and it showed significant results for these movements, meaning that the income gains were due to employment and not actually to increased wages as you moved. And then we moved, these are the main takeaways, that there is a positive impact of intercity migration on economic mobility. However, it's inconclusive for metro moves, which is not really in line with other studies, and it could be a question for further research. It shows that even secondary cities are giving people jobs and increasing their incomes, and there's also not a significant premium whether you have high skills or whether you had low skills. It could have something to do with the labor market, maybe not really giving employment rewards, or giving jobs to even people with high skills. And then I'll skip this slide, but we can move to the policy implications, that we should encourage investment in smaller urban centers and intermediary cities, not just major metros, as we have seen that even people who are moving there are getting gains in terms of income and employment opportunities. This can reduce pressure on larger cities, and we should avoid negative migration narratives. We know migration as something that is limiting to the infrastructure of destination cities, and also we know it as something that results in informal settlements, but we should see it in the positive light of bringing many people out of poverty. Migration between cities. Lastly, there should be support for low-skilled migrants, because most policies, especially in the developed world, they want to attract high skills, but maybe not yet in South Africa, but there should be support for even low-skilled migrants, because they are also benefiting from moving, and they are coming out of poverty, and they also contribute to the economies of the destination cities. Thank you very much.
All right, so I'll take some of this offline, but I'm really quite skeptical of your identification strategy. Migration is certainly not exogenous in such a way that you can run a diff and diff on it. The fixed effect version requires a lot of pretty strong assumptions that also are unlikely to hold. So I think you're just showing us that on average, people that have migrated have done better, which I think is acceptable and perfectly logical and expected. I think one of the bigger reasons for that is because people tend to move for a reason, right? And you're just picking that up on average. But I actually just want to come to this point. So this is something that always kind of gets me in the back of my mind. If I want to try to make some policy implications, I think about, well, what did I model, right? So I modeled migration and wages. I didn't model anything about support for low-skilled workers, right? So I don't know if support for low-skilled workers actually does anything, right? So I'm really should be hesitant to suggest anything for policy from a low-skill migration point of view. Promoting balanced regional development is also not really something you're able to say anything about. You're just showing us that people that move, whether they move to big cities or smaller cities, do better, right? If we balance out the entire regional development story, that might actually give you different results, right? So try to limit your policy implications to, in principle, what you specifically analyze as much as possible.
Thanks very much. Just moving off of exactly those points. Again, sitting on a policy point of view, I was in government engaging on oversight visits of municipalities in the Western Cape, and there are a number of stronger intermediary cities that people are moving to, like Paarl, Stellenbosch, along the George area. And what's interesting is I'm trying to, understanding the reality on the ground, I was trying to map it into your research findings. We know that the lower skilled are moving for access to services, primarily education and health, first and foremost. Interestingly, some of the cities, intermediary cities that are investing for this wave, and Ivan, I got your point that you need to invest ahead of the time. Drakenstein or Paarl invested way ahead of the time, but not for they told me quite poor blank to my face. We don't want those poor people. We want the rich ratepayers in Val de Vie. So when you're talking about the policy implications, I was trying to figure out between your research and understanding on the ground, there are different dynamics. And certainly that Drakenstein team is not going to be offering any incentives for lower skilled people to come and live where they access free basic services, etc. So there's a very big tension in the ground, on the reality on the ground, and we have to be careful of. You're quite correct. We have to be careful of incorrect narratives, and we try to correct that at Drakenstein. They've got actually an affordable housing crisis now, and the work that Kathy Stone, Alan, the work that they did, we put on the table and said, have you read this report? Teachers can't afford your houses in your munis. So what I want to, is that you need to ground truth. Some of your research findings as well. And be careful, I completely agree with previous speaker, you need to be careful of the policy recommendations. But certainly this is the kind of research that we do want to see, understanding the patterns of migration between secondary cities, why people are moving, who's moving, etc. Just be careful of some of the policy recommendations. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. It seems what's coming from the discussants is that my policy recommendations are too strong. But I mean, the results have shown that, you know, low-skilled people are getting jobs, right? If they had shown that they are not getting jobs or their incomes are not increasing, then I think I would have believed that my recommendations are too strong. So I don't think they're too strong. I think low-skilled people are not only going to stay in informal settlements and, you know, getting services, but they're actually getting jobs. Unfortunately, it needs data. We don't know if they are formal jobs or informal jobs. But what's important is that they are working and getting an income. Yeah, but I take that, and you know, perhaps I can tone them down, but I still think you know, they're important recommendations to that. But you know, we can discuss more of this during the tea break, and you know, you can help me, you know, package them well. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think the point is already made about the sort of agency of people and making choices, which Catherine Cross, on her work on migration, made a really big point about trying to understand that kind of survey literature of how people make choices, and that would have been, you know, I think that's useful to look at. Maybe on the secondary cities and the we can talk a bit later, but there's quite a lot of evidence that upping spending in source areas of migration can actually accelerate. It reduces the risks of people migrating. So, you know, it's sort of thinking about the other side of that coin, how you'd actually realize a policy like that. And you know, I think actually our experience in South Africa, where we do quite heavily bias allocations to rural municipalities in national funding, kind of makes that point, perhaps, that we're just reducing the barriers to migration
Yeah.
for households or individuals. Yeah.
Thank you for the point. Yeah, I think the human being doesn't want to migrate. I think it's the last resort. So that's where the regional development point came in. That if we're to focus on these cities, you know, we can reduce the strain on services that's taking place in metros. So that's the regional development point. But thank you for your inputs. I'd love to discuss more over, you know, over tea about what's happening in secondary cities, and what the colleague mentioned about the Drankensberg. Sorry?
In the Western Cape.
Oh, okay. All right. I'll be glad to speak to you